John, the floor is yours.
Good afternoon, and on behalf of the EMG, a very warm welcome to part 2 of the Stockholm+50 Roundtable Nexus Dialogue Series. I'm John Scanlon. I'm going to be moderating today's session as I did last week, and we are delighted to either welcome you back or welcome you for the first time. As was the case last week, I'm sitting here in International Environmental House with Hussein Pardee. He's just over here next to me. Also here with Janica Pitkanen over on my right, and a number of other colleagues from the EMG. And we also have Arthur Dahl with us in the room at International Environmental House today, which is great to see. It's nice to be in the presence of some real people. As you know, moderating sessions like this online can be a little bit more challenging than being in person, but it's great to be in the presence of good friends and colleagues here in International Environmental House. And we're going to work together with the panelists and the discussants to make this session as engaging and as interactive as we can. Now, we've got 2 hours set aside for today's dialogue, during which time we're going to hear some opening statements. We'll hear from our panelists and discussants. And if all goes according to plan, we'll have time at the end to take on a number of your questions. In this context, as you know, Zoom has a question and answer function, so feel free to submit your questions at any time. And if you see a particular question that you like, please vote for it, because those questions that get the most votes will float to the top and be more likely to be asked when we come to them at the end of the session. Now, our good colleague in New York, Nina Arden, she is going to be keeping an eye on the questions that come through, and she will feed them through to us as we go through today's session. Now, as you know, UNEP is the Secretariat for Stockholm+50. The Executive Director serves as the Secretary General for the conference, and the EMG will be contributing towards the preparations, and Sweden and Kenya are co-presidents of the conference. And as with last week, in our opening session, we are fortunate to be able to hear from representatives of the EMG, of UNEP and Sweden. And we're going to start with our good friend and colleague, Hussein Pardee, who is very well known to all of you, to offer some opening remarks and some welcoming remarks. Hussein, over to you.
Thank you very much, John, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening to friends, colleagues. First of all, let me thank you, John, for accepting to moderate this important dialogue. I would like very much also to thank all of the colleagues, distinguished speakers who have also accepted to be part of the panel. We are very much proud and humbled to see the faces of distinguished colleagues who have been in this history of the environmental governance for the last 50 years, and we're delighted to have them all in this dialogue. This is the second part of the dialogue on the Stockholm+50 conference. The EMG has been mandated to provide a system-wide contribution to the international meeting, providing a stakeholder perspective from the UN system. We have a process including organization of these 2 dialogues, organization of individual interviews with heads of UN agencies, and also survey of existing materials in order to synthesize these inputs by the UN system and to provide them to the international meeting. One of the principles in this process that we wanted to make sure it will happen is the matter of being very open, very frank in receiving and also in having an exchange by our stakeholders, especially the UN system, in order to look at the environmental issues from a much wider perspective, learning having the lessons that we have learned from the COVID and other crises that are surrounding us from the environment, from the humanitarian and the political arena. So we would very much appreciate to have this very encompassing discussion in these dialogues. We are not making any negotiated document out of this process. We really want to have very open discussion in order to offer certain perspectives to the international meeting for the future of the environmental agenda. So very much look forward to this presentation today. And I also would like to convey the warm words of Lissinger, the Secretary of the EMG, who unfortunately couldn't attend this call. She's secretary of the EMG, and she would have been delighted to come if there was not other prior commitments. So with that, I do not want to take a lot of our time here in the beginning, but we're really looking forward to a very successful and fruitful discussion. Over to you, John.
Great, thanks Hussein, and likewise. Now, as you know, the UNEP Secretariat effort for Stockholm+50 is being led out of its New York office. And Haruko Okusu was recently recruited from the CITES Secretariat, which is based here in International Environmental House as well, to support this preparatory effort as Principal Coordination Officer. And I'm pleased that Haruko is with us again today to tell us a little bit about her role. Haruko, over to you.
Thank you very much, John, for the nice introduction. First of all, I'd like to thank the EMG, both the Secretariat and also its members, for convening this Nexus Dialogue Series dedicated to Stockholm+50. And also extra thanks to the distinguished speakers and discussants for contributing their time and wisdom during the two sessions. These will greatly enrich the outcomes of the Stockholm+50 International Meeting, which will take place on 2nd and 3rd of June next year. The long theme of the Stockholm+50 is actually Stockholm+50, a healthy planet for the prosperity of all, our responsibility or opportunity. And it's really great that EMG has decided to have two parts to this dialogue. The first part talked about our responsibility, and the second part, which is taking place today, is talking about our opportunity. The first dialogue that took place last week really focused on the responsibility and what has the expectation been in 1972 when the actual Stockholm conference took place. And it was really, I got the impression that the ambitions and aspirations that were actually expressed in 1972 were still relevant and important today. And also a lot of the discussants and the panelists talked about how these aspirations and expectations were realized in the past and also continues to be realized today through different multilateral tools that have been established over the last 50 years. Against this backdrop, I really look forward to the second dialogue today, which focuses really on the opportunity and the action. And with the participation of very high-level representatives, bringing their rich set of experience, including such areas like human rights, humanitarian issues, different sectors such as energy, forestry, construction. And it's also great that we're continuing to have a strong representation of the youth and indigenous communities. And these are sort of the outcome and the representation that we would very much like to mirror at the Stockholm+50 International Meeting. So this really acts as a mini paradigm of what we would like to do in June. I think we would also like to hear a little bit more from you during this Nexus Dialogues about how the new enlightened leadership might look like on environmental multilateralism and how Stockholm+50 can act as a turning point, not just a time for reflection, but making it an inflection point to turn the tide and to create a better future on a healthy planet as part of our responsibility to present and future generations. We would also like to hear any views on alternative paradigms that we could envisage, and how can we together reimagine a healthy planet that realizes development and prosperity for all. And with that, I'd like to thank you very much again, and very much look forward to hearing the dialogue. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Haruko. And we certainly have the right panelists and discussants with us today to pick up on all of those questions that you've posed. And by way of opening statements, last but by no means least, we're delighted to have Sweden's ambassador for Stockholm+50, Johanna Lissinger Peitz. Now, Johanna, last week, she promised that by this week, she'd offer us some observations about last week's panel. And so we're going to hold you to that, Johanna, to hear your remarks on what you took out of last week, but also your remarks on the road from here to Stockholm+50 in June next year. Over to you, Johanna.
Thank you very much, John, and good morning, good afternoon to colleagues around the world. And maybe if I just start with, I think, Hussein's kind of setting of the whole discussions with being, open, frank, and a wider perspective to the environment dimension is, I think, exactly what we are hoping to hear out from this conversation, but also I think the kind of sense that we would see surrounding the pathway leading up to Stockholm+50. And I, as him, feel extremely humble for all of the experience and knowledge last week and also this week. And I felt also, I left the 2 hours being very, I think, inspired and lots of news ideas. It's always, difficult to summarize or take out reflections of such a rich discussion as we had, but I think I had like 3 or 4 points that kind of stayed with me a little longer than also kind of influenced my work and thoughts for the rest of last week up to now. And someone said, and I'm not going to attribute this to different speakers because I don't necessarily remember who said it, but someone said that the challenges ahead of us are bigger than one single country. And I think a lot of interventions last week really focused on the working togetherness. So this is not a one country challenge. This is really an opportunity and a responsibility of the multilateralism and the multilateral system to work with the opportunities and the crisis that stands in front of us. I also heard, I think, many of the speakers with different words in different ways, somehow talking about the making peace with nature, redefining humankind's relationship to nature, transforming humankind's relationship to nature. And one can choose to phrase this in different ways, but I think all of them are saying that there needs to be a change, and there needs to be a change in how we relate to nature as a resource, and how we actually do things in both on a systematic level, but also sometimes on an individual level. The other thing that I took with me was very much the importance of the multi-stakeholder approach, and the I think focus on an engagement of youth, the importance of engaging and learning from the indigenous people's perspective, and I'm really looking forward to hear this later today. And someone also said that if we are, and I may not phrase this correctly, but someone expressed the way, so if we are to meet the crisis of today, are we really equipped to doing so? And if we are to succeed, we need to look within and without the UN system, which again, think for me is kind of emphasizing that this is really about the network of different stakeholders working together to accelerate implementations of commitments. And then, of course, there was a lot of, I think, experience drawn from the governance structures that has been in place for almost 50 years now, and how well are they allowing us to react to a very different world. So I think these would be my 1, 2, 3, 4. I think key kind of takeaways from last week, and putting maybe that in the context of Stockholm+50. Then I would say that from our side, and this is of course also an engagement and a process where we are working closely together with our co-host from Kenya and with UNEP as the focal point. But this is really not just a commemoration of Stockholm, but I think of the multilateral systems in the way of how do we deliver on current and future opportunities and challenges. It's about very much taking responsibility to course correct the path where we are at, making sure that the footprints of now is not hampering our well-being for future or current generations. But it's also, and I think even more importantly, about seizing the opportunity of a very necessary and conscious transition, contributing to a future worth believing in and a future for future generations. I spent quite a lot of time last year in different dialogues with the youth, and I know we have also colleagues here who will speak about this later. But I think one thing that I took away from those discussions were very much providing a picture of the future where you can see how you can contribute in a meaningful way. So I think I spoke about this briefly last time also, and I don't want to repeat too much, but I think as host, our vision is very much in the sense of providing where do we want to go, and that is really picking up on what's said last time in contributing to a renewed or redefined or transformative humankind's relationship to nature. So using Stockholm+50 as an accelerator to that change. And in essence, looking at on how we will contribute is very much so focusing on implementation. I think we know what we need to do. We have the technology, we have our commitments, we have the science, but focusing on how do we transform that to implementation. Then also focusing on the interconnectivity. I think that came out also last week quite a lot, that and Hussein was somehow alluding to this, I think, in his opening statement also, that the environment dimension is so interlinked to so many other issues, and we can't solve it one by separation, but this is really at nexus opportunities, I would say, which will take, I think, from all of us to come out a little bit of our comfort zone and see opportunities also in other fields and not just the one that one represent. And the last kind of part is a strong intergenerational aspect. And with this, I think for the vision and ambition of Stockholm to really contribute to strengthen environmental materialism, to contribute to the longer term systematic changes that we need to see. So moving in a sense from system risks to system opportunities, and also to contribute to the immediate actions. So somewhere there's kind of this focus on the urgency and on the ambition, and doing that in a multi-stakeholder co-creation process. I don't think at this time, because I want to leave sufficient time to other colleagues, I'm not going to speak about the structure, leadership dialogues. I'm happy to respond to questions on that, but I thought it would be more important to somehow set the vision for the work ahead. So thank you very much, John.
Wonderful. Thank you, Johanna. That was a great summary of what we talked about last week and setting the scene from now to June 2022. And thanks to you and Hussein Haruko for providing such a wonderful platform for us to launch from as we move into the dialogue. And I'd like to tell you what we have planned for you this afternoon as we move to the dialogue part of this session. As mentioned last week, we were looking back to 1972, the successes, the challenges, and the lessons learned since then. And Johanna, you've just given us your summary, and the EMG team here in Geneva is going to capture a summary of last week's event and this week's event, and that'll be available in December. Just a few things that struck me, and that it's similar to what you said, Johanna, but so many speakers placed emphasis on the interlinkages with the economic and social dimensions of sustainable development, and we're not just looking at interlinkages within the environmental dimension of sustainable development. The importance of fairness, equity, human rights, and we're going to hear a lot more about that today, and the need for deeper cooperation amongst everyone within the UN, with stakeholders and amongst states. And we've got a great panel to discuss these issues today. Now, today, we're going to be focusing on the future. We're going to look forward. What can we do more of, less of, or differently? What urgent actions should we take? And how can we enhance cooperation and coherence? With the session being titled Foreseeing the Future of Our Responsibility and Opportunity. And we're really fortunate to have 5 speakers and 4 discussants for today. And they bring together a blend of those who have had vast experience in working either with or within the UN system, together with those that are perhaps more towards the start of their careers. And as Jamil Ahmed said last week, it's important to bring different generations together. And that's something we're doing today. And that's something that's going to happen in Stockholm+50 next year. As with last week, each panelist will have around 5 minutes to offer their personal reflections and perspectives on foreseeing the future. And we're not seeking to build a consensus on these issues. Rather, we want to hear from, learn from, the experience of our speakers and to draw from their wisdom and their ideas as the EMG prepares its inputs into the preparatory process. So in that context, we've not scripted any of the speakers. They're free to focus on any issue that they find most compelling. And all of us, myself included, will hear what they have to say for the first time today. And we're all very much looking forward to that. Now, each panelist is going to be followed by a discussant. They're invited to offer their observations on the panelist presentation, but also to share their own personal perspectives and experiences. And today we're going to benefit from learning from an Indigenous perspective and the perspective of youth as we look ahead to the next 50 years. Now, all of our panelists and discussants have very impressive CVs, and some are highly experienced and internationally recognized experts in their fields. However, in the interest of time, they've kindly agreed that I not read out their full CVs when introducing them. Rather, I'll give a general introduction and introduce them by their current title, and they will then be free to share details of their experience with or within the UN as it pertains to their presentation. And I'm really grateful to the speakers for agreeing to that. Now we're going to move to our first panelist in a moment, but just a reminder, you can insert your question in the Q&A function in Zoom, and you can either put in your own question, or if you see a question that you like, vote in favor of it and it will float up to the top. Now, I'm delighted to move to our first speaker, and we've heard a lot about cooperation and coherence, and we could not possibly have a better panelist to start with than Adnan Amin, someone who has been at the center of this for decades. Adnan had a long and distinguished career with the UN. That included being the chief executive or the head of the chief executive's board for coordinations. That was not just looking at the environment, that was looking at the entire UN system. He's worked in the New York office for UNEP. He's headed IRENA, which I'll read out in full in a moment, but he has had an extraordinary level of experience within the UN and with other agencies. So we couldn't start with anyone better. Adnan is the former Director General of the International Renewable Energy Agency and is a senior fellow at Harvard's Belfer Center. Adnan, welcome and over to you.
Thank you very much, John, and thank you for your kind introduction. I'm very conscious that there are going to be around 15 speakers and we're almost 25% of the way through. So I'll be very short and perhaps just talk about a few ideas, and you'll be relieved to know I don't have a speech. Let me start by saying I was extraordinarily privileged in the early part of my career to join the United Nations Environment Program as a young economist in the early days. I had the great privilege of working with some of the architects of Stockholm+50, Maurice Strong, Mustafa Tolba. Arthur Dahl is sitting right there. He was in the Secretariat. I think he was in the Secretariat in those days. And it was a remarkable moment in time because it was a culmination, the first demonstrated culmination of global environmental concern leading to political outcomes of significance. It followed Silent Spring, upswelling of concern for health, concern for the planet. And I think the outcome was something extraordinary. And the first decade or two of UNEP, I think, were also extraordinary. Really, UNEP was the architect of the international environmental framework that we have today. Virtually every convention that we talk of, global environmental convention, came out of UNEP. That includes climate, by the way, although it's a separate convention, but biodiversity, hazardous waste, chemicals, the internationalization of the principle of prior informed consent. So it played a remarkably important role in creating a new normative structure for an issue that had been out of control before the organization was controlled and which had immense consequences for the future of the world. And I think that UNEP succeeded fabulously in its first 20 years. I think that the creation of the body of international law, of the programs, of capacity building of countries. I worked in my early days on institution building. I was in Mozambique, in Vietnam, in Malawi, building the first environmental ministries of those countries. And many of those ministries were a result of what happened with UNEP. So I think you can say that it was a remarkable exercise in international relations, multilateralism, but it was also in a particular historical context when we had, a geopolitical framework within which multilateralism was working in certain ways and which could have parameters of success around it. Then we had the discussion about sustainability, sustainable development, had the preparation for the UNCED. I think Arthur went along there also, and we had, almost a sense of institutional competition in the UN system at that time, which I found, which were actually quite destructive in a way, in that it didn't allow us to come to coherent outcomes because of the politics involved in it. But essentially, we came out with a new institutional structure within the UN for sustainable development. You had the existence of UNEP. You had separated conventions who were independent entities. You had the emergence of what you could say was the beginning of a fragmentation of the environmental agenda on the one hand, but you had this critical concept of sustainable development uniting economic, social, and environmental issues in one framework, which was essential for the future. I think, I had something to do with this, but the first mistake we made was because of this institutional competition. I was very much involved in the negotiation of the follow-up arrangements to UNCED in New York. And we adopted, I think it was resolution 47-188, if my memory is still working, which is on institutional arrangements in the UN. And we created the Commission on Sustainable Development and Environment, UNEP, with the mandate of taking care of the environmental component of sustainable development. It was very carefully negotiated. We felt it was important at that time to maintain the integrity of UNEP, to maintain its identity as a leader in the environmental field. But what we inadvertently did, in hindsight now, I believe, is that we contributed to the fragmentation of the agenda, and we contributed to a situation where UNEP potentially became more pigeonholed. Everybody could push back whenever UNEP wanted to expand its ambit and look at the implications of environment across sectors by saying, you focus on the environmental dimension, and the economic and social dimensions will be taken care of others. I think that's an issue we need to discuss, because I think increasingly we are living in a world of fast-moving economic, political, technological change. The geopolitics around multilateralism has changed immensely. There is a huge concern that the UN system is still operating on the basis of its assumptions about multilateralism 10, 15 years ago. I think the trends that we are seeing today in terms of how we classify developing countries, how mega trends that are changing the world are shaping up is deficient. We need to really think very carefully about what is happening and what the implications for institutional design are. And I think that Stockholm+50 has a real opportunity, if it's honestly done, to look at institutional arrangements that cut across the board and contribute to a rationalization and streamlining within the UN that allows rational decisions to be made. Now, in terms of change, I ran the world's first international renewable energy agency. I built that agency and its programming and so on. And I can tell you, if I look at the energy field, it cuts across everything: environment, development, society. But we realized that technological change, innovation, investment patterns were changing the world of energy in ways that nobody had anticipated, at a speed nobody had understood. We now have an energy transition. I was talking about this many years ago, Adil will remember, which people were poo-pooing at the time, but are now scrambling to accommodate in terms of its implications for the global economy and the environment. We have investment patterns and capital allocation decisions and pricing of different sources of energy changing very, very fast in a dynamic environment. And the question can always be asked is, why is there no energy organization with any global mandate in the United Nations? Was it kept out, and why? And I think that's important because we need to look at how institutional coherence within the UN leads to decision-making in a world that is changing, that is potentially fragmented, that has huge resource issues. I mean, if we just look at the trends in terms of food security, I just saw a statistic today which shocked me, which said that if we continue with the current trends of climate change, by 2050, we will not be able to meet 50% of world food demand because of the deterioration of agriculture. Now, if you imagine social political consequences of that, these are truly, history-changing events that we are living through today. And we need to understand the enormity of what is happening. And on the other hand, we have technological development happening at a pace in virtually every field that nobody is equipped to deal with. We have the distinction between developed and developing countries becoming less political as it had in the past and changing dramatically. And I can tell you, for instance, I come from Kenya. If you look at the innovation ecosystem in Kenya in terms of the new startups, new technologies, new tech, interconnectedness, it is a dynamic and vibrant ecosystem. It's the same in many developing countries. We've seen in institutions, in ministries in developing countries that capacity, knowledge, qualified people are tremendous and capable, but the limitations are in capital or other limitations. But do we have a UN system that is today able to deal with this fast changing world and to look at development and its interface with developing countries in a different way? And I would submit, and with all apologies, I love my colleagues and friends in the UN, it is not equipped to do it. I ran the first large reform process that Kofi, our late distinguished Secretary General Kofi Annan commissioned, system-wide coherence at the end of his term. We ran a one-year process and we came to a number of important conclusions about institutional coherence in the UN system, coordination, breaking down barriers, streamlining functioning of the system. And some of them were very practical. And very few of them carried through because of the inertia in the multilateral system that we see right now. And how do we overcome that? I think there is equally a massive environmental and economic and social issue that we have to confront as an international community, but we also have to confront the idea of what is multilateralism in this new geopolitical framework. Now, just to illustrate a couple of the issues, and I'll close, that we need to really pay attention to. I mentioned food security as one of those issues that we need to be really concerned about. But since I left the international sphere, I've had dozens of fund managers, of venture fund guys, of investment houses calling me to ask me for advice on sustainability, ESG, and where investment should be going in a world where ESG is becoming prioritized. And one of the key issues that they bring up is that when we look at ESG, we understand that there is shareholder demand, which is pushing us in this direction. We understand that capital allocation decisions and the price of capital for sustainability is favorable today. We want to invest in these fields, but we have no reliable and standardized data on the basis of which we can make judgments and on which we can begin to move the needle. And let me tell you that there is an immense amount of capital in the system, in institutional investors, in venture funds around the world, in sovereign funds around the world. And if we are able to create a framework where a neutral, authoritative UN system can provide the kind of data and information for decision-making for the future in economics, that we will start to make a difference in terms of how the future looks to us. We need to move that capital out of destructive uses into constructive applications and future economy built on sustainability, for which there is a business case today. But the UN is not a player in this field. I'm out there a lot. I don't see the UN as a player in this field. And I think that, as we think through how multilateralism needs to evolve, we need a deep understanding of the challenges that we are facing and how we are going to address those. So my last point is about risk and uncertainty. We're entering into a era of risk and uncertainty. Environment is part of that, but it's across the board. And we're looking at coming out of a global pandemic that has shown every vulnerable point and every fault line in the global economy in stark relief. We have endured a supply chain disruption that mirrors the kind of changes that we're seeing in the global economy. We are seeing massive changes in investment, geopolitical consequences of positioning of different countries around different production methods. And we are seeing the potential of momentous changes in capital allocation in the future. Multilateralism today is still addressing sectoralized issues, still resides with boxes, is still consumed at the international institutions level by institutional competition, which I always found extremely destructive to the UN. I saw many colleagues in the UN who became warriors for their organization against another organization fighting for turf. And that's a waste of resources. We cannot afford that. If we want credibility as the United Nations in the international system today, there needs to be a radical rethink about that. There needs to be a radical rethink about what the future of UNEP should be. And to be absolutely honest, despite my love for the organization, my alma mater, which I spent many happy years, it's regarded as a niche organization. It's in competition with NGOs. It has some residual programming, which is of consequence, like the GAP report every year that has been there for some years and is provided to the UNFCCC, and it's a very important report. But there is nothing demonstrating its relevance to a changing global environment today. We have environmental institutions in the Convention Secretariat, sorry, John, which are frozen in time. Are they just an office supporting the administration of a legal agreement, or do they have programmatic functions? And if they have programmatic functions, how does that cohere with the rest of the system? These are all fundamental questions that need to be asked. I could talk for 2 hours. I know Adil is sitting, I'm dying to hear what he says, but I'm delighted to be part of this. And I must tell you that I have my heart is still with UNEP and UNEP's agenda, and I'm very happy to be part of this conversation. Thank you very much.
Great, thanks Adnan for those fascinating insights and for giving us a much broader landscape within which to view these issues, the whole multilateral system and all the other issues you raise. I think you've set us off beautifully for this discussion today. And we're going to move to the first discussant, and it's Benjamin Schachter, and he's a human rights officer with OCHA. Now, he's had very deep experience there with the human rights agenda, but in particular been looking at issues to do with the rights of Indigenous peoples, looking at the issues to do with climate change, and he's currently focusing on advancing the human right to a clean, healthy and sustainable environment. So he's done a lot of work with the UNFCCC and others. Delighted to have you with us today, Benjamin, and I'll hand over to you.
Thank you, John, and it's an honor to be here on behalf of the UN Human Rights Office. I lead our work on the right to a healthy environment and climate change, and have been doing that since 2015. And that involves engagement with a number of multilateral processes, partners in the UN and external stakeholders and states. I understand my direction to be in part to respond to some of the things we've heard so far, and I want to do that, and then maybe share a little bit more related to our work on right to a healthy environment as well. So I think Adnan, it was quite interesting to hear you talking about the fragmentation within the UN system. That is a challenge which a number of recent initiatives are aiming to address, including the Secretary General's call to action for human rights, our common agenda, and of course the work of the Environment Management Group itself. And within the confines of the Environment Management Group, we have an issue management group on human rights and environment, working very closely across agencies on issues related to the human right to a healthy environment. And I think one of the things that the human right to a healthy environment does very nicely is it bridges, at least conceptually, a lot of the gaps between social and environmental elements of sustainability. And it creates an overarching umbrella under which we can all work within the UN system on some of these issues, because it includes, safe and stable climate, pollution-free environment, healthy ecosystems and biodiversity, but also access to information, access to justice, and participation, and that sort of rights-based approach to action in the environmental arena. So I think advancement of the human right to a healthy environment is really a critical opportunity for the UN system in light of the recent Human Rights Council resolution on recognizing the right to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment as a human right for everybody. And that was foreshadowed in many ways by Principle 1 in the Stockholm Declaration, but it's taken us a long time to get to the point where the Human Rights Council has now issued this landmark resolution. The points on energy, I think, are also really interesting and important in that transition to energy, to renewable energy, and access to energy for all is very much a human rights issue. So, I think there's an evolving discussion there about how we address issues related to renewable energy that definitely has strong human rights implications. And the question of sort of, creating a framework for the UN to move capital towards sustainable consumption and production, and to address sustainability and environmental and social governance. I think, again, this is pointing towards something that's really a key element of the human rights and environment nexus, which is that businesses have responsibilities too, and we need to indeed create frameworks which account for and help us monitor and evaluate their compliance with those responsibilities. So the application of the UN guiding principles on business and human rights to the context of environmental harm is a really critical one. It's something our office has been working on and put out messages on, and something that the working group on business and human rights has worked on extensively as well. So with those sort of initial responses, I also wanted to refer to the work that we've started doing on what we're calling the human rights economy, right? Which is actually about directing resources and constructing an economy that is responsive to human rights commitments. And so I think all of these things actually fall under the umbrella of the human right to a healthy environment, and really want to kind of speak a little bit more on that in terms of what are some of the pieces and areas of work that we need to move forward. And there we have technology and the right to benefit from science and its applications as an important piece, right? That we need to ensure, and we have an opportunity to ensure that all people benefit from science and its applications as called for under the Convention on economic, social, and cultural rights, and in fact, use that technology to advance the effective enjoyment of a right to a healthy environment. We have other matters related to the means of implementation. So there is a human rights obligation to facilitate international cooperation. And when we're talking about sort of failings or potential failings of the multilateral system, we're really talking about a failing of the system to comply with that obligation to cooperate for the realization of human rights. In terms of information and access to justice and participation, again, all of these sort of rights are critical towards an effective implementation of any sort of environmental action. And one of the greatest failings here that we see is with respect to protection of environmental human rights defenders. I mean, we absolutely will not have effective action to protect the environment if we continue to live in societies that permit the defenders of the environment to be attacked and killed with impunity. So, again, these are the challenges, but also, let's say, the opportunities and things that we can address. And if we do better going forward, we can help start realizing that vision of a humanity better connected with nature. And in closing, I just wanted to also flag the importance of a human rights-based approach to addressing inequalities and the disproportionate impacts on particular groups, persons, and peoples in vulnerable situations. So a gender-responsive, age-inclusive, disability-inclusive approach is critical, that is participatory, that complies with Indigenous peoples' free, prior, informed consent with respect to actions being taken, and so on and so forth. And I think I already mentioned, that in terms of addressing the UN system work on this, there are a number of different processes and efforts underway between UN Human Rights Office and many of our UN partners, including in the context of the EMG, and including this discussion itself, to try to cross some of those bridges and work together more effectively. And we're looking forward to the rest of this discussion and hearing about how we can do that better. And thank you very much for the opportunity to contribute.
Thank you very much, Benjamin, and thank you for elaborating on the human rights-based approach, because it was something raised many times last week, and I'm sure it's going to be discussed a lot today. So very helpful. And we also heard last week a lot of discussion about the need for frameworks, as you were saying, Adnan, as well, to direct energy and investment in the right direction. And how do you set those frameworks to see that happen? So thank you very much. We're going to move to our second panelist. He's sitting here with us. He's just sitting over to my left, but he has his own screen. Arthur Dahl. Now, last week we heard from Jan Gustaf, and Jan Gustaf attended the Stockholm conference back in 1972, and so did Arthur. Not only did he attend that, but Arthur also attended all the subsequent conferences that were held in Rio, Johannesburg and Rio. He's had a long experience within the UN, in particular with UNEP. And he's also been actively involved in a large number of meetings at the Conference of the Parties to various conventions. Adnan, you mentioned conventions earlier and the need for them to synergize. But we're delighted to have Arthur with us today. His current title is President, International Environment Forum. Arthur, over to you.
So my apologies, you're muted.
Yes, you go ahead.
My apologies, and I'm going to ask Arthur, he was saying something very interesting, but we only heard it here. So Arthur, if you could just
Should I
proceed?
unmute?
That's okay. Yep.
Okay, I don't.
Yep.
Well, I say, for those of you who are youth following us here, when I was a youth 60 years ago, driven by my values, I wanted to think, what can I do to be of service to the world community, humanity? I decided to become a system scientist, because if you want to change a system, the best leverage point is at the most fundamental level in its values, that are the rules of its operation that define its purpose, its ethical framework. And so drawing on my research as a coral reef ecologist, I've seen how that ecosystem depends on cooperation and reciprocity, on solidarity and unity and diversity, with each species finding its unique place in the system in collaboration with all the others. With this foundation, what is desirable to bring about constructive change towards social and environmental sustainability, I've always tried to be of service to humanity and to the planet that sustains us. When I represented the Baha'i international community at the Stockholm Conference on the Human Environment in 1972, I called for in Committee 1 for the inclusion of collaboration with non-governmental organizations in the action plan, and we succeeded. In the South Pacific Commission, where I went afterwards, as the regional ecological advisor to all the Pacific Island countries, I brought together science with indigenous knowledge and worldviews in organizing the Secretariat of the Pacific Regional Environment Program, helping the islands to see what they had in common, both in unique ecosystems and cultures and in their vulnerability, and that working together was in their common interest. As Deputy Director of Oceans and Coastal Areas in UNEP, I helped to build the regional seas programs around the world. In preparing the Rio Earth Summit in 1992, we had multi-stakeholder working parties on all the key issues, bringing together the UN agencies, scientists, and non-governmental organizations. The Conference Secretary General, Maurice Strong, requested my secondment to a secretariat to include small island developing states in Agenda 21. And I ended up doing the final drafting of Chapter 17 on oceans, coastal areas, and small islands, launching the CITES process with conferences in Barbados, Mauritius, and Samoa, where the islands could see, as small as they were separately, they had much in common, including 43 votes in the UN General Assembly. Then I was named coordinator of the UN System-Wide Earthwatch after Rio, and I orchestrated interagency collaboration with the scientific community, a bit like the EMG today. We developed indicators of sustainable development for the Commission on Sustainable Development. And we prepared an integrated global urban strategy that led to the creation of the Intergovernmental Group on Earth Observations. Building on the lessons learned last year with two colleagues, we published a book, Global Governance and the Emergence of Global Institutions for the 21st Century at Cambridge University Press, to propose the necessary reforms of the whole UN system, and launched a global governance forum to take these ideas forward. Last month, with the Climate Governance Commission, of which I'm a member, we published a paper called Towards a Global Environment Agency, Effective Governance for Shared Ecological Risk, where we reviewed all the proposals to improve UNEP and said what we really need is a science-based institution able to adopt binding global legislation to protect planetary boundaries in the common global interest, then to negotiate equitable sharing of responsibilities to stay within those boundaries across the states and multinational corporations, and to implement and enforce these decisions with adequate resources for capacity building where needed. Really a level of governance, because we can't do anything else at present level. That's the only way we can hope to avoid climate, biodiversity, and pollution catastrophes, and to build a more just, united, and sustainable world. To provide the information for this process, we talked about indicators. I launched 2 weeks ago an online reflection on global systems accounting beyond economics, proposing accounts of the carbon cycle using carbon as the currency, both to be able to tax releases of fossil carbon and to reward sequestration to the benefit of developing countries with natural systems to protect. So we sort of close the circle of accounting, look at carbon all through the system. The same thing could be done for biodiversity in their own currency, for pollution, for minimum subsistence to eliminate poverty and in the world on the economic side. For the food system, your FAO could develop food accounts of the production and consumption of food to make sure everybody is properly fed. For human health, WHO could take a lead there. For work and employment with the ILO, can we find employment for everybody in some part of this global system? And for knowledge and education, say with UNESCO, each with their own relevant currency, to provide a new global definition of wealth in terms of human and environmental well-being, not financial measures, but in dimensions of sustainability, to get away from everything turned into money, which then leads to all the distortions in the present financial system. So I think Stockholm+50 will be an opportunity to take this agenda forward, just as we did 50 years ago. So I encourage the youth today, jump in there, and let's take it forward for the next 50 years and beyond. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you very much, Arthur. And you have all the energy and enthusiasm of a youth from 1972. So great to see that, and really for sharing this systems-wide approach, but also not only talking about the importance of collaboration, but showing how collaboration has worked.
Yeah.
I guess sometimes you get a sense of deja vu, yeah?
Well, to a sense, but I think the same thing, it shows what you can do.
Yeah.
One person motivated with the right values to be of service, also the doors open. So
Yeah.
the youth today, jump in there, let's take it forward.
Excellent. It's so much easier talking to someone face to face than talking to someone on a screen. So thanks for that, Arthur. Fabulous. And we're going to move to our next discussant, Zinta Zommers. Lovely to have you with us. She's a humanitarian affairs officer and working in anticipatory financing at OCHA. She's done a lot of different things with a lot of different organizations. She's been working on the 4th Geo Outlook report with IPCC. She's been working with the Secretary General's Climate Change Support Team, amongst many other activities. And she has worked both in Kenya and in Germany in different capacities. But she's here with us today as Humanitarian Affairs Officer, Anticipatory Financing. Zinta, over to you.
Great. Well, thank you very much for having me, and it's a real pleasure to be here. As a discussant, I also understand that I should respond first quickly to Arthur's comments. And certainly, Arthur, I feel like I need to go and read your book. So I hope that there'll be more insights gleaned from that. But the 2 points that really jumped out at me from your input, one is the ecosystems approach. And sharing that. When I was with the Secretary General's office during the negotiation of the Paris Climate Change Agreement at EOSG, there was a real sense that the UN is an ecosystem. And at its best, every agency, every convention should play a part working together. So we've mentioned that there's a great deal of fragmentation, and how do we overcome that? But there's also at the highest levels an understanding that some agencies should be doing technical work, some should be implementing, and each has their role. And a lot of it is about making sure that our own ecosystem functions effectively. The second thing that I thought was very interesting, Arthur, from your comments, is this notion of the binding global legislation and compacts. And I think that's a real challenge compared to, we've mentioned human rights in this discussion today, but a real challenge is the enforcement of some of the environmental agreements, and also the notion that we need to have, for example, we see this being played out in the UNFCCC, universal consensus, which often becomes the bottom line. And then there are other cases across the UN system where that kind of, you can move forward without universal consensus, for example. So I think there could be lessons learned going forward about how we can apply some of the practices from other sectors to the environmental sector to make sure that we really make progress in the next 50 years. So I'll quickly, my remarks, I just want to say 3 quick things about what we can do more, less, and differently. But first, I'd like to remind us that, I think we have made real progress. When I was a child, acid rain, for example, was a huge issue. And in many places around the world, we've resolved that issue. I used to collect bottles of air in glass jars because of some of the air pollution issues that we dealt with. But we know how to deal with that now. It still exists in many parts of Asia, but we have the solutions. That said, children born today will face 7 times more heat waves and 3 times more floods and droughts I was a child. So there are areas where we have made no progress and where we need to have much more progress. So I think, it's the glass is half empty, half full. We do have solutions. We do need to act more and faster. So how do we do that? Well, what can we do more of? As was mentioned previously, the UN has been very successful in providing technical progress to governments, learning best practice, sharing information, helping build those environmental ministries, as Adnan mentioned. And I've, in my work in Sierra Leone, for example, I was there to provide that kind of support to governments at the request of governments. So I think that's one area we can do more of. Doing less, as Greta said, less blah, blah, blah. I think, we've mentioned the fragmentation issue. We've mentioned the fact that we haven't moved fast enough. So we need to find ways we can really get from practicing action to that transformative change. And so how do we do that? What do we do differently? Well, one is we need to make, as was mentioned, the multilateral system fit for the 21st century. And as part of that, I think we need to have, we've mentioned already, broader stakeholder inclusion, youth, civil society, even the private sector. How do we get them involved in an institution that was designed for governments, for member states? We need more of that and those questions answered. We need to be nimbler. COVID might be forcing us to do that. We're having this discussion online. We all wish we could be together, but the fact that we're online, we've saved on carbon emissions. We can do this from around the world in different places. So maybe there are lessons we can learn about how to be a global institution today using 21st century technology. We also obviously mentioned more finance. We need better financing for actions. And there was discussion in the chat about merging the environment ministries with finance ministries. We can get into that later, but we need more finance to implement these actions, both, for example, in the climate sector. We need to scale climate finance by 4 to 8 times over the next decade to have action. And we need, as was mentioned, I think, enforcement, some kind of way that we can make sure that if you don't play by these rules, there will be consequences. I'll end there because I know that we're short of time, but I look forward to discussing these over the next few months. And certainly, I'd just say that the humanitarian sector, the fact that I'm come from an environmental background, but now sitting in the humanitarian sector also shows that every agency in the UN is now interested in this part and can play a role and needs to scale up the action on some of these environmental issues.
Great, thanks. It's really interesting. And this issue of enforcement or compliance and enforcement, the whole issue of consensus and looking at other ways forward other than consensus, really interesting and challenging questions as we go forward. With that, I'm going to move to our next panelist, Adil Najam. And he is a distinguished academic. He has so many particular titles I could ascribe to him. There are too many to mention, but he has had a long and very distinguished career in academia, and also he's been intersecting with the UN in many different ways, including with the IPCC. He's been engaged with the non-government sector, including WWF, and he was nominated by the UN Secretary General to serve as on the UN Committee for Development Policy. His current title is Dean Frederick S. Pardee School of Global Studies, Boston University. Adil, lovely to have you with us, and over to you.
Thank you, John. Thank you, Hussein. Thank you for having me here. Thank you for giving me this opportunity to be with friends, old and new, and be part of this important discussion. Thank you for that kind introduction. The much better one really is I spent at least my little life trying to understand the international system as it works on the environment, and therefore starting with UNEP, with Stockholm. And years ago, my thesis, which I just found I have here with me, was on Stockholm, and I put that up simply because that's what's going to structure my comments. I also I'm proud to say that I sometimes feel like the last standing friend of UNEP, though not in this company, but certainly outside UNEP. And this is part of my Stockholm story. I'm very grateful to previous speakers, Arthur, but especially to Adnan, because my comments are really very much in that. Though Adnan, 47,188, I think, was desertification. 47,191, you're exactly right, is what created the commission. And well-meaning as it might have been, instead, it might have broadened things, but it certainly didn't focus the attention, I think, in hindsight. But let me use my few minutes this way. I was thinking, if those who were active at Stockholm were back with us and right now, as Arthur is, and as the last meeting you also had, and in the same mood they were 50 years ago, what would they be surprised by? And how would that surprise translate if we asked them to write the agenda for Stockholm+50? And so that's the question I've been puzzling in my head. And here is what I think. I think I have 5 points I think they might be surprised by. But more than that, I think they will be surprised that we are still talking about Stockholm. I think they will smile because they would not have been arrogant enough to think it would become that important. But on the other hand, they would also be surprised because they would have thought that much of what they had set out to do would have a much smaller shelf life to completion than half a century, right? Let's just highlight that, half a century. And they would have thought in their optimism at that point that this would have been done, or what they had set out, not including new stuff, would have been done in that 50 years. So I think that's the big thing. I do not say that in a facetious manner. I say that in a serious manner. They would be also happy. They would be happy that their format took off. Remember, there were only 2 heads of states at Stockholm. You know, these head of state mela are now regular, right? Head of states have faster jets. And so they jump for 5 minutes from one meeting to the other, meaningless as it might be. The 2 who came to Stockholm really meant it. That was Olof Palme and Indira Gandhi of India. Unfortunately, both were later killed. But they came because they were interested, not because they thought their votes depended on it. And therefore, they came and acted differently. And that model of the summit, we also very often don't remember, at least my students I highlight, really came out of Stockholm. It wasn't the only place it came out, but that model succeeded. The most elaborate success of that model was Stockholm, which then became replicated, not always well, most importantly at Rio and so on and so forth. So in all of those senses, you know, they would be surprised. They would be surprised that the biggest issue, substantive issue they talked about, which was nuclear, is no longer discussed in these 2 meetings, but they would not be surprised and somewhat saddened that the other biggest issue that they struggled with unsuccessfully is the one we struggle with unsuccessfully. And that is the issue of development and environment. Remember, Stockholm nearly didn't happen. Developing countries nearly till 2 weeks before the meeting had said they would not come to Stockholm. And there was this meeting in Pune, very much like this, Hussein, what you're doing, which eventually created a promise, not always fulfilled, that got the developing countries to come there. In some ways, I think developing countries 50 years ago were about as angry as they are today. I'll come to that in a minute. And then Soviet bloc actually didn't show up. So I give this as a historical record in terms of saying, as we think of 50 and beyond, that context is not unconsequential. Let me put the 5 thoughts that I think they would be surprised by very, very briefly. First, the public update, including by business and society, I think they would be totally blown away by. In many ways, people at Stockholm probably thought that their own biggest goal was to make environment a public issue. It was to elevate the issue, and in some ways they would have not expected, especially business, to now always talk about it, whether they mean it or not. I think they would be somewhat disappointed about how non-threatening environment had become, because people have internalized that you can promise and not do anything, but their big push to make environment a global issue at the same level as health, as energy, as other issues that the UN dealt with, peace, I think they would have been totally blown away at how it has happened, though I think they would have a tinge of sadness, but realistic understanding that in that process, the sloganeering has also increased. The second one is what others, and Adnan in particular, have talked about. I think they would be very surprised. They would have a smile that UNEP got created. Even when Stockholm ended and agreed it would be created, there were question marks. They would be very happy at its first few years. I think they would not be entirely happy at how busy the system has become. There were clearly two models of environmental governance at Stockholm. One of them, and neither of them came to fruition. One of them was UNEP, as they used to call it, the WHO, as the apex body, technically competent, authoritative voice, the word used in the Stockholm Declaration, the environmental conscience of the earth, which was meant to do what other major agencies did. There was a different model, which was, this is so important, let everyone do a little of it. And in some ways, neither happened. But I think overall, and this is what I meant by friend of UNEP, overall, the record has been quite amazing for an agency as strapped for cash, for authority, for ability, that what it has done has been quite amazing. I was just quickly looking up, what might have happened differently. In some ways, they would also be surprised, as I said, how busy the system is, how every agency, no matter what it does, has to have an environmental person now. You can't get away. It's like politicians. You have to talk about it. You have to create a post. Now, here is what would happen. UN, by what I could find, currently has about 100,000, a little over 100,000 people, staff, all of the UN. UNEP, I believe, has a little over 1,000. By my rough calculation, if you add the number of people with environmental portfolio in all UN agencies, that is around 7,500, which, if they were in one place, would make that agency bigger than UNDP. Right? Now, I'm not suggesting do this or do that, but what I'm saying is that's a lot of things that weren't there when Stockholm was happening and what they were pushing for. The third thing that I think they would be very, very surprised by is how active developing countries are in environmental policy, including in climate policy. That they could not have expected, because recall 50 years ago, as I said, developing countries were very reluctant partners at Stockholm, not because they were not interested in environment, they were very interested. That's why FUNE happened. That's why Mehboob Haq brought these people. That's why Maurice Strong and others sort of gave them sort of this framework and this promise. The problem was developing countries were not convinced that environment would not come at the expense of development. This was about pushing the development ladder in the name of environment. That was the language used. And in that sense, the world has changed probably more dramatically than anything else. For good or bad, developing countries bought this. And here is the problem, especially after Glasgow. I have not seen developing countries as angry about the international environmental world as they were at Glasgow. Much more than they were at Rio, for example, where I also was. Because there is this setting in that 50 years of these promises are not being kept. Wink, wink, come to environment, we'll talk about development too. And once you are there, development is pushed out. And it becomes an environmental agenda. That, again, I have too little time to go into it. But that's the thing that would preoccupy them if they were planning Stockholm+50. They would want renewal of that wow. They would want renewal of the enthusiasm that was first generated by developing countries, because in 50 years, it has, while the activity has enhanced, while the slogans and words have enhanced, especially in the climate arena, there is a very real challenge now. And you saw that in Glasgow with the 100 billion question and so on and so forth. Fourth, I'm trying to finish in a minute. I think they would be absolutely blown over by how many treaties, agreements, non-treaty negotiation there is. And they would not like it. Many at Stockholm thought Stockholm was spending too much time negotiating, because this was supposed to be an activist meeting. But they would be totally blown over by how much the system has become a system of non-negotiation, meaning somehow producing documents. If someone could just add up how much paper has been printed in the name of these agreements and how that relates to the Amazon, that would be a good exercise for the EMG to take. I'm being cynical here, but the point is, they would immediately recognize, boy, what we created here was not a system of environmental implementation, but of constant bureaucratic negotiation, most of which even has no standing. The purpose of meetings has become neither to monitor nor to implement, but to come to some statement that can be put out in the media and now on social media and so on and so forth. Again, my cynicism shows, but I hope you see also the hope. In some ways, Stockholm was ahead, not only of its time, but of our times, because it was so much more, look at Stockholm documents, it was so much more implementation focused than even Glasgow and Paris were. And that, I think, is when we think of Stockholm+50, what they would be thinking about. Finally, and I hope I don't get into trouble for this, I hope this will be seen in the spirit it is given. Youth. I think those at Stockholm, and Arthur can tell us more, will not be surprised by the youth attention. I don't think they will be surprised. I think they'll be very happy. I think we oldies now think the youth is new. And even people who were young when they themselves were doing this have forgotten that they were young once. Stockholm was entirely a result of a youth movement. Stockholm was very different from Greta in that it wasn't that the youth were outside saying, do something. Stockholm happened because of a youth movement. And for that, you have to go back to Earth Day and so on and so forth. And in fact, every major movement has happened because of that. So that, I think, those are the type of things. I have too little time here, but I hope those are the things, the type of things that they would be thinking about. And what I want to sort of end with in this sense is that the system we live in is the child of Stockholm. We are all children of Stockholm, whether we were there or not. The next year is Stockholm+50, but it's also Nairobi+10. People forget this already. There was a meeting called Stockholm+10. It was held in Nairobi. People like me have argued that was the beginning of the fall. That is when the romance started wearing off, when reality hit. But next year is not just Stockholm+50 or Nairobi+10, it's WCED+35, our common future. Our common future, which gave us the word sustainable development and the push for sustainable development, came because Stockholm had promised developing countries that we won't let development go. That's the progression of how it happened. It's also Rio+30, it's Paris+7, it's Glasgow+1. Do whatever, but we are children of Stockholm. Thank you.
Adil, thank you very much for that really novel and engaging way of addressing this subject matter. I wish I was one of your students, although I'm too old to be one of your students, but I think they're certainly very fortunate. But really fascinating. And last week as well, one of our speakers took us back to the documents from Stockholm, and it is enlightening to go back and have a look at the text, and encourage everyone to do that. So thanks for that. We're all young once. I'm sitting here near Arthur. He's not young anymore, but he's certainly very sprightly. And we are now going to move to a youth representative. So a perfect way to finish your intervention there, Adil. They were all young once, but some are young now. And we're going to have with us as the next discussant, Felipe Gomez-Gayo. He is the president of the Student Platform for Engineering Education Development, nominated by the youth constituency of UNEP. He's had a long engagement with youth-related issues, involved in many particular processes, including with the UNFCCC, which is very timely given we've just had Glasgow and Adil just referenced that, but involved with UNEP and all manner of other processes. So delighted to have a representative of youth with us today to share his perspective. Philippe, over to you.
Thank you very much. It is always an honor to share the stage with a lot of important people, and it's really inspiring to hear all of you and your interventions. Today, I want to talk about a little bit of my experience working on my master's thesis because it really connects with what Dr. Adil just shared. And I'm working, in my work, I did a revision of the Stockholm+50 declaration. And for me, it was one of the most concerning things that I found. It's like the document, it could be written in 2021, and it can also meant a lot, like it meant the same. And it made me feel like in 50 years, we have done nothing because the document, how it reads, it reflects a lot of what is happening in 2021. So that's a really reason for concern that I found. It's really empowering as well to hear how the youth have impacted the Stockholm 1972, because the youth are the voices that need to be heard right now. It is rather important to, like, when the youth is knocking at the door, that we open the door for them to be able to share their experiences and their voices to be heard. It was really nice to hear the 5 points that Dr. Adil shared regarding the Stockholm+50. In terms of that, I just wanted to share also the importance of how the agreements are being held and all of the bureaucracy surrounding them. It's really baffling that when you go to the negotiations and just see a lot of politicians talking about stuff, they just take a lot of time to make decisions, and we need to take urgent decisions now because we don't have the time to spare in the coming years. We are celebrating 50 years of Stockholm, but I don't think we have any more 50 years to add on and to start making action. Also, another concerning thing that I have found is we started with 2030, and we were talking about, hey, we need to reach a lot of things by 2030, but now the conversations are going towards 2050. What is going to happen when we reach 2050? Are we going to add another extra 10 or 20 years? Until when are we going to push back our deadlines? And when are we going to have some concrete actions towards the environmental crisis that we are living in? But yeah, my final message would be, let's continue empowering youth around the globe. We have a voice that needs to be heard. We have a lot of ideas that need to be pushed forward. And I'm really interested in continuing our discussion later on. Thank you.
Thank you, Philippe, and thanks for sharing that perspective. And certainly Stockholm, and I know the co-presidents and Johanna, who's with us today, is very keen on engaging youth and hearing the youth perspective. We hope that we can also give you some sense of hope of the progress that's been made over 50 years. Not fast enough, but some progress has been made. And let's hope the next 50 years we put the foot on the accelerator. Actually, in the next 1 year, we put the foot on the accelerator, to be frank. So thank you very much for that, and look forward to your engagement in the conference itself. We're going to move to our next panelist. Delighted to have Joan Carling with us. Joan is an Indigenous rights activist and environmental defender from the Philippines. She's actively participated in many global processes. There are too many to mention, but it includes the Climate Convention and REDD+. She was awarded the Lifetime Achievement Award as a champion of the earth by the UN Environment Programme back in 2018. And amongst many current roles, she is the Executive Director of the Indigenous Peoples' Rights International. Delighted to have you with us. Over to you, Joan.
Yeah, thank you for having me here. I want to reflect back a bit on the living in harmony as a way forward, and coming from an indigenous perspective, this is something that we already imbibe or live. And what I want to share are, I think, important values and principles that can also guide us in moving to a healthy environment or healthy planet. So of course, we already know the issue of sustainability and the reciprocal relations that we need to have with nature, and that interdependence mean that we also need to make sure that there is something left for the future generation. So at the outset, there is already this intergenerational regard on how we use our resources. So in this light, it is also against wasting anything, right? Because we need to conserve it for the future generation. And I think that is pointing us to what we have now, the problem of consumerism and overproduction, because we are just, the production is, I mean, production is not dictated already by need. Production is dictated by the need for profit. And if we want to have a sustainable world, we need to change that. We need to go back to a system where we do not produce waste. And I think that is one of the principles that we carry. The other one is also upholding the common good, that we share what we have, and that guides the survival, the collective survival of indigenous peoples as we interact with our environment. And if we reflect that again to this, it is also against the greed. And that is the one that is driving a lot of environmental concerns that we face. We know, for example, that companies are not guided by the environmental, they're not taking so much the environmental impact of their activities, but more looking into the profit that they can generate. And then that is then seen, presented in a way that they are contributing to development and even sustainable development. So if we look at also the issue of how do we balance or put environment at the center, then that whole idea of sharing the common good can also guide us. Then the other one that I feel lacking, I was also in Glasgow, was the sense of solidarity, that we are all interconnected. What happens in the north will affect the people in the south, but there's just no sense of solidarity in the context of also of the common but differentiated responsibilities, where those that have the more, those who are more responsible, should take on the more, should also contribute most, but so that, you know, we all survive. But that is not the spirit that unfortunately that we feel now, and it's really saddening from my perspective, because it's already going against from my perspective, it's going against the DNA, my DNA, that we need to cooperate and have a sense of solidarity so that we all survive. Not just, you know, in the present days, not just the rich countries or not just the few elite who has the means to cope with whatever impact of say the climate change will have. So so with that, and because Ben already spoke a while ago, and I fully agree and support his views, also in relation to the need to integrate human rights in the context of also protecting the environment, in a way that the way that we can support those that are conserving the environment, which are partly the indigenous peoples, is also to ensure that their rights are recognized and respected, right? Because what's happening now is that the areas that we conserve, like 60 to 80% of biodiversity is in indigenous territories, but we don't have the legal recognition over these resources, and thereby it's highly vulnerable to be exploited for vested interests. And And thereby the policy action that's needed is to ensure that those that are the stewards of nature are also protected, including their rights. And that is the nexus between environment and human rights, including environment defenders. In my observation also, what is needed now with this, as everybody was saying, but my context more is the need for policy coherence in the context of putting environment and human rights at the center. And when I say policy coherence, it has to be guided by clear measures on how we protect the environment in the face of economic development or in driving sustainable development. If we do not put and the environmental dimension as the lens for policy coherence, if we do not put the social dimension as well, human rights as the lens, then there will always be a trade-off, and environment will always be the one, and human rights as well, because it's the economic interest, again, by the few, and that is also why inequality is worsening precisely because of that. So that is also the reason why, as Ben explained, we cannot isolate the issue of inequality with the way environment is being destroyed. It's being destroyed because a group of people are benefiting from it. And unless we also address that, we have clear measures to address that as part of an overall policy coherence to regulate those that are destroying the environment. Because if there is no regulation and there is no accountability mechanism that we put in place to the destroyers of the environment, then that will continue. And I believe in this context, the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights is very, very important. It's a very important tool to also regulate how business is recognizing human rights, but also the environment. So now that what is now evolving from there is the environment and human rights due diligence in the conduct of business. So this is an important element to deal with the worsening destruction of environment. But finally, also I want to mention the right to healthy environment. I mean, to relate what I've been saying in the way we operationalize the right to healthy environment, that these are the key elements on how we want to achieve the right to healthy environment. And finally, just to conclude, that I think the contributions of indigenous peoples to environment protection has always been disregarded, if I may say, or not fully acknowledged and appreciated. The fact that we are being killed when we protect the environment and only few are standing up for our brothers and sisters who are sacrificing their lives is already an indication that there is lack of appreciation, and that is something that I think we need to also make it more visible, and at the same time that recognize that indigenous peoples are providing the solutions and are the actors in relation to environment protection. So with that note, I think when we're looking at this issue of the right to healthy environment as we move to a healthier planet, it's also important that we recognize the role of rights holders and stewards of nature, including also environment defenders. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Joan, and putting the environmental and social dimension at the center of this, and having it so that it directs the economic dimension rather than the other way around, and a recognition of the roles of Indigenous peoples. Hopefully that will be further reinforced through the Convention on Biological Diversity process that will be concluding in Kunming in May, where the role of Indigenous peoples in protecting nature and therefore protecting our climate and everything else seems to be getting much more traction and recognition than it's had in the past. With that, we'll move to our fourth discussant, and we have Sarah Gonzalez. She's going to bring a very much a youth and climate perspective. She's a climate youth activist from Costa Rica. She's a consultant with UNICEF as well. She's had a lot of experience in this space, including in 2019, she organized the first youth event to be held at a pre-COP event for COP25 under the Climate Convention. And she's also been very active in establishing vast networks amongst the youth, which I'm sure she can talk about. And she was recognized recently through the Midori Prize for Biodiversity. Sarah, over to you.
Hi, thank you for the invitation. I fully share the urgency to listen to young people and include ourselves in that process. This is a key point to accelerate action on the environmental dimension, and that is why I add that is urgent that in United Nations have as mandate that all the policies and action that we develop in the environmental dimension will be sensitive to children and youth. That implies integrate them as agents of change, and also that what we do in environmental matters respond to their realities, as well as integrate the rights of the child. And this is also a knowledge that environmental impacts are going to have different repercussions on people, and that there are people who are more vulnerable. Here too, the other speakers have mentioned a lot about funding. So here I would like to invite it to United Nations to work and seek funding mechanisms that allow young leaders to access this fund. The action that young people carry out have a high value and are truly voluntary. We could increase their impact and stability if they had the necessary resources. I also share that it's certain that we are creating alliances with private sector. It is a key actor and that we occupy to see more active doing the necessary transformation in the face of the environmental and climate crisis. And finally, I share that we need the United Nations to work more articulate and unified. We must see all the instances of the United Nations as a single great work team. That will also have better cooperation with the countries in the environmental dimension. And of course, the United Nations is also guided by intergenerational work. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sarah, and for highlighting the importance of engaging with the youth. And I'm sure that that message was picked up by everyone, including Johanna, our Swedish ambassador for Stockholm+50, and very important engagement. And I know they're very keen on that. We're going to move to our final speaker for today. And that is Paula Deda. She's the Director of Forest, Land and Housing Division with UNECE. Paula is very familiar with the International Environmental House. She actually was once with the Environment Management Group, so she knows it extremely well. But she's had a wonderful career in the UN that's gone on for more than 20 years, serving in many different capacities in many different places. But she joins us today in her capacity as Director of Forest, Land and Housing Division with UNECE, with a very UN-looking background. Looks wonderful there. Paula, over to you.
Thank you very much, John. Thank you very much for this invitation. And yes, indeed, I am joining you as ECE, where actually the Stockholm process started at the very beginning, and there was no UNEP at the time, with regional commissions, in particular UNECE was doing a lot of the environmental work. Let me just start by saying that I found this discussion fascinating, and talking about youth. I was thinking how much I would appreciate being, if I were an environmental student of environmental diplomacy, to have the recording of today's session, and probably also the previous one. There's so much to learn, and also so much to learn on what to avoid in the future. It was very interesting, Felipe, to hear you saying, Well, I mean, if you look at the declaration, it would be good also for today. Well, it's not only because we have not achieved many of those goals, but also because the generation changes. So we all want to have our own documents. The same happened to me a few years ago. I found a forestry declaration from 1947. It was almost identical to the document I was preparing. And, sometimes just terminology might change here and there, but the fundamental principles are the same. So that's really a key point. And that should actually put all generations like me and new generations like you together to review these old documents. That will be a very important exercise because it will also make us realize that we don't need to reinvent the wheel. We know what we want to do, less words and more action. But we tend then to be very excited about drafting these documents and negotiating when someone has done it actually before us already. Now, if I may, as I'm the last one, John, let me just speak a few things here and there. I heard a message from Adnan Amin on probably the UN is not equipped now for the world of today and the challenges of today, and actually wanted to just give a few comments based on my experience. I see that on the one hand, we need to simplify the UN because there are too many overlapping processes. One attempt that was mentioned was under Kofi Annan with this, delivering as one. And there are many now also for coordination and coherence. Well, I don't think we are succeeding very much at that. And this is something that if you ask me, perhaps in a very radical way, but just call the UN, and then, under the big UN having different departments. Probably this will be going against what the UN has been doing for 50 years, becoming more and more sectorial, more and more specialized. But if we want to work across the board with human rights, indigenous rights, environment, social, economic issues, perhaps being one will help a lot. On the other hand, however, we need to respond to a more complex society. Society has changed very much since the UN was created and also since 50 years ago. And I can tell you with my experience, for instance, we are trying in my work to engage very much with cities directly. Now, there's a need for multilateralism. Really, their cities are bigger than countries. So there are cities that have their own environmental policies and they're very successful and they could share their experience with others. But somehow cities are not properly integrated in our UN system, of course, because it's United Nations, it's not United Cities. So how do we do that? How do we engage cities? How do we engage other stakeholders? And Stockholm had already opened the door for that. We have done it, and at least my impression from my experience, we did it quite well at Rio and post-Rio, and then we lost a bit the ability to bring stakeholders back in. And this call from youth, I think, should be very much welcome because that's what they do. They bring many different voices in a new way into this dialogue. So I think this is essential. And the last point to me is really the relevance of digitalization, and for many things, not only for having this meeting today and many similar ones. We understand, and the pandemic made us understand, of course, having Zoom and Teams is a great thing, but it goes beyond that. I think it's also an economic issue. I agree very much with the indigenous representative, sorry, I don't remember her name, that everything at the end revolves around the issue of profit. And the point is, can we just stop discussing profit as of tomorrow? We go out to big companies and say, look, be good. Let's just forget about profit. The world probably will collapse. What we have to do is to shift to a different type of economic system. Digitalization can help us very much, avoiding many services that are not that are actually now mechanical and physical, going towards the services that are delivered online. And I'm not talking only having conferences like that. I'm talking also about culture and alternatives to, for instance, mass production or what I call destructions of modern society, because capitalism, for instance, and I'm one of the areas I'm covering, for instance, is sustainable fashion. fast fashion very often is a more a psychological factor than a real need. So is also very often, the overproduction, for instance, of other objects and products. So how can we replace those needs by providing more and easier access to culture to people through the digital world? Why not? I'm very much sure that this could be a very effective alternative to what, as I mentioned, I call distractions. Another very good point that she also made was about an alternative model of development. And for that, I think we have to look into really turning to a circular economy. And this is something I know UNEP is doing, many other UN agencies are doing. And the moment we finish resources, we will be forced to do that. Perhaps we have to start a bit earlier, right? So we avoid other catastrophes. And I believe that, and I believe actually very much in young generations for that. They are the ones that have experienced basically the bad consequences of our linear economy. And they have realized that there are alternatives. They are already experiencing these alternatives and they're pushing for those. So I hope that the message, and then I'm not saying that, I'm washing my hands and I'm just saying, no, everything is in the hand of youth and you have to deal with that. I'm just saying that I really believe the UN system has to connect more with youth, also through events like this, because as I said, the only thing that youth might miss is the history and what we have done already and why it did not work, so they avoid redoing it, including rewriting same documents that we have already written 50 years ago. I stop here. I just wanted to give a little bit of summary and pick up on the things that really stuck to my mind through this conversation, but with a big thank you again, because it was extremely interesting. And I really hope that this type of dialogues will continue, because I think a lot can be learned from it. So thank you, and back to you, John. Thanks,
Paula. And that's a lovely note to finish our formal discussion on. And I think today we've done exactly what you were hoping for, which is where you can bring generations together, share the documentation that goes back some time, contemporize it, and see somehow that we actually have some very good text from the past. Perhaps we haven't been so good at implementing a lot of it. We have some time for questions now, not a lot of time, but there's been a few questions come, and I'll just have a look at my WhatsApp feed where a few questions have been fed through. First question I have here is perhaps picks up on some of the earlier discussions we had on UNEP and the UN system and the competition within the UN system that Adnan kicked off. Question is, in order for the UN to improve coherence and efficiency, would it make sense to combine the UN Environment Programme and UN Development Programme and call it the UN Sustainable Development Programme, which can follow up on the implementation of the SDGs? Anyone like to, if you just put your physical hand up there? Yes, Adnan, I'll pass that one over to you.
Yeah, I saw that very interesting question came up after I spoke. And let me say, it's not a new idea, but it's been perceived very differently by different people. So I worked with one executive director who saw it as a mortal threat to UNEP. And I worked with another who saw it as an opportunity to take control of the agenda. So they had different views. I think it's common sense that we should bring the different elements of the agenda together in a management framework. But it's happening in the context of an institutional framework that's evolved over 75 years, which has acquired a lot of kind of constitutional baggage along the way, a lot of complexity. And I think what would be useful is to think in terms of functions. We have an operational function, we have an analytical and normative function, we have a function, of developing international agreements in the context of geopolitical competition. So how we accommodate all of these different objectives in the context of institutional redesign is something that's very pressing, in my view. Paula mentioned delivering as one. When we delivered that report, there was a big push for coherence at the country level. You know, we had found things like there were country offices, there were like 30 country offices of UN agencies in one developing country with an average of $5 million disposable income after they paid for their houses and their cars and their offices. Now you go to a developing country today and you tell them, I want to give you a $200,000 capacity building program in X, for which I will have to get consultancy because the competence doesn't reside in the organization. It's not serious. It's not serious to have a fragmented operational structure at country level representing 15 sectoral interests without coordination. And it's an invitation for fragmented funding for donors who are competing at the national level themselves to push their agendas, who are selectively financing specific opportunities with different organizations, further driving lack of coherence. So I think it's a systemic issue. We need to think through what are the core functions for the UN system to perform today. I think it needs to be, this needs to be almost a Bretton Woods moment in terms of institutional redesign, in terms of how we're going to deal with the global threats that we face today. Honestly, if you look at the severity of the trends of environmental degradation, if you look at all that the climate science is telling us in terms of if we exceed 2 degrees, which is still a very, very possible scenario, what kind of catastrophic consequences there are for water, for food, for, you know, livelihoods, for political stability and social stability in countries. So there are immense issues. I think had we talked about the merger of UNEP and UNDP as the institutional outcome of the Rio conference, I think there could have been a productive discussion at that time. Today, we're past that. Today, we need institutional redesign, root and branch. And I'll tell you what an important part of that has to be, in my view, and Adil very importantly mentioned it, in the context of developing countries being outraged by the performative hypocrisy that was evidenced at Glasgow. I'm talking in my personal capacity now. I think there is a perception, a very strong perception, that there's an asymmetry of representation in the environmental institutions of the UN, with the predominance of representation or power in the hands of the North, both in terms of management as well as in terms of representation by countries. I'm not criticizing anybody. I'm telling you what I have observed and what I understand from more and more countries in terms of how they perceive this. And they perceive the evolution of the environmental agenda in the directions that it is going. I mean, if you go back to Glasgow as a reference point again, everything is on the basis of mitigation. We had no delivery on climate finance, and what climate finance was delivered, 70% of that was private financing. In the old days, we used to call it loans for indebted countries that are dealing with the consequences of global change that is not their cause, are taking loans which they have to repay with interest. So I think there is really a growing disconnect in terms of how different parts of the world look at the environmental agenda. Our representatives from youth and from indigenous people in particular mentioned the justice issue. Environmental justice has to be at the center of these concerns, whether it's among countries, whether it's intergenerational justice. You know, I see my kids looking at me accusingly as your generation is the one that left the disaster we're going to have to clean up. And you know, they're not entirely wrong. Until we bring the question of justice, of common sense, of equity, political equity in participation and representation in the UN, and we address the relevance and institutional framework of the UN with its ability to deliver the outcomes for these huge global issues that we're dealing with, we're going to continue to have big problems.
Thanks, Adnan. And certainly the issue of justice and equity was something that arose a lot last week as well as this week. I'm just wondering, to you and others, you talked about the need for some fundamental reform here, you know, a complete rethink. Is that sort of drive for a fundamental rethink coming from anywhere, or is it just not being picked up and nobody's wanting to move ahead with a fundamental rethink? I can see Arthur. Yeah.
But I think this is the rethink has to be the entire economic system, which is driven by the wrong values and concentrates wealth as opposed to, and is extracting wealth from the developing countries through debt repayments and all the rest of it. So the system is fundamentally broken. It's not just the environment. We still need somebody looking at the planetary boundaries to protect these new things we're encountered that weren't there 75 years ago. But we also need to rethink how we reallocate the benefits of the world. And that's why I think we have to get away from an accounting system that puts profit or money first and start saying, let's look at those things that count, like making sure that everybody has enough to live, that we can eliminate poverty in the world. That was a priority in 1987. And when sustainable development came with that, and we've gotten worse on that rather than better, except for a few countries that have done some progress. But I think it's not just UNDP and UNEP. It's just the whole system has the wrong drivers taking us the wrong direction, and that's why it needs a fundamental rethink at that level. But the best interests don't want it because that's the struggle we're facing, I think. And Stockholm can be a place to debate those issues and try to put them into a broader context.
Thanks, Arthur. And I think that's something that's cropped up last week and this week, is that we're not just looking at the environmental dimension, it's looking at the interface with the social and the economic dimension, and it's much bigger than looking at one or two institutions within the system. It's more fundamental than that. And as Joan said, the problem of consumption and production is it's not about satisfying needs, but satisfying the need for profit. So we continually come back to this last week and this week. Johanna, it puts a lot on the shoulders of Stockholm+50, but I think continually we're seeing some fundamental questions emerge that go beyond tinkering around the edges. I can see Adil is seeking the floor.
Thank you, John. Just to add to what's already been said, you asked where would the impetus come from for a rethink. How much of a rethink is a separate question. I think one place it would come from or should come from is COVID. When you start doing this, you are either hopefully coming out of COVID truly, or you've resigned to the fact you're not going to come out of COVID. In either case, what's uppermost in everyone's mind is, what has COVID taught us about how to deal with crisis? The first truly global crisis of our lifetime, and the multilateral system failed. Essentially failed. I speak as a friend, but it wasn't anywhere. Every country said, I'm going to put up my wall. Right? Many good things happened. One good thing that happened is we realized big money is not big money. Money is not a problem. When you honestly believe there's a crisis, when you honestly believe it's existential, $1 trillion can be found in 1 week, and $1 trillion can be spent in 9 days. And then 2 weeks later, another $1 trillion can be found, and that only in one country, right? In a way, what it made us realize was that the lie about environment is we all talk about it, but we really don't think it's existential in the way COVID became existential. We stopped driving, right? So in some ways, I'm not trying to grandstand here. I'm saying if there is a rethink, that rethink will have the shadow of this experience that the whole world has gone through. And someone, I hope Stockholm+50, helps the world recognize how to learn from it. Science, a great success. No one would have expected that in 11 months, you would have a vaccine that works. Amazing, right? The power of science. On the other hand, COVID also taught us how scientifically illiterate we want to be. Right? How many people will refuse the science no matter what? COVID also taught us, not COVID, in climate, a vaccine won't be a solution, right? It's not like climate change will happen and then we'll find a vaccine and we'll be okay. So what I'm getting at is, in some ways, I hope Stockholm+50, if it is to become like Rio or original Stockholm, instead of having an expanded agenda, has actually a limited agenda. One sentence, if you allow me. In some ways, environment Stockholm's success has been the problem also. There was a time when every issue wanted to be associated with trade, because people thought trade is where it's happening, right? So whatever your issue, you added it to trade. That is now happening with environment. Remember all those conferences of trade and this, trade and that? In a way, what's that also doing is we as people who care about the environment also need to sort of help the world focus again. Otherwise, we'll dilute it so much that the UN dilution is minuscule in front of that public dilution of something that is so big that we can't do anything about it. But I think the Stockholm+50 moment is a real moment for reflection, focus, and thought, given the world we are in today.
Wonderful, thank you, Adil. And I think that's an excellent point upon which to wrap up this afternoon's discussion. What I would like to do is to offer Johanna the opportunity to offer any observations. Johanna, it's been a really rich discussion today. I'm sure you've picked up a lot from it. I certainly have, and everyone here has. But if you'd like to offer some observations and reflections, and then I'm going to hand over to Hussein to close us off. We can't hear you, Johanna. We'll give you a few moments just to get your audio working. What I might do, Johanna, while you are fixing up your audio, I'm going to take the opportunity to pass to Hussein, if that's all right. Being conscious of the hour, are you happy with that, Hussein? So I'm not going to try and summarize today's discussion. We're going to have a summary come from the EMG, and that'll be available next week for both of these sessions. I just want to thank all of the panelists, discussants, and speakers today. Really rich session, very engaging, very interesting, really helping, I think, set a path to Stockholm. And I'm going to pass to Hussein. If Johanna can hear me, Johanna, I'm going to, are you there? Can we hear you?
I can hear you now. Can you hear me?
Brilliant, Johanna. Yeah, I just made a few closing remarks. I'm going to go to you and then go to Hussein for the final remarks. Johanna, over to you.
Apologies for the technology. Well, a few comments. There's kind of there are several keywords, but there are two things that I wanted to pick up specifically. One is, I think, the youth issue that has been spoken about quite a lot. And Felipe, you spoke about, the Stockholm principles and the Stockholm Declaration at the time, and that feeling very relevant also today. And John, as you have said, I think several times, the meaningful involvement of youth in the pathway leading up to Stockholm and at Stockholm+50 itself is of extremely importance to us. We did launch in Glasgow a youth task force. And Felipe, if I'm correct, I think actually you are on that task force. And while you were speaking, I was thinking, and this is an invitation for you to take on board or not, but it would actually be quite an interesting exercise for the youth task force to look at the 1972 document and see what does it mean today. What's the interpretation of the youth community of today of 1972's outcome document. So I give that to you, and then I leave it up to you to take it on board or not. But that's a little bit what I was curious to hear about from that. The other issue I did want to kind of speak a little bit extra about is, in a sense, combining the justice, solidarity, equity issue to an issue of trust. I think this was mentioned and exemplified by many through Glasgow, through the 2-year delay of delivering on the 100 billions. That is, I think, not helpful for any multilateral process. And I think having an opportunity in an environment as Stockholm+50, which is not a negotiating fora, which is not, a COP, but to have that honest discussion on, what does the transition mean? What kind of finance is needed? And how do we deliver on our promises made is something that we think could actually benefit throughout the multilateral system. And we would be very interested, I think, with working with partners on that issue. just a couple of other reactions, and I'm kind of just looking at what is our mandate for Stockholm+50, which is different than it was 50 years ago, which is different from a UNFCCC COP or a CBD COP or a Rio Plus meeting, and where the focus is really on accelerating implementation of commitments in the context of the Sustainable Development Agenda. I think Joan spoke a lot about the upholding of the common good. I think I take that with me as an important key message to go throughout the 3 leadership dialogues that are setting the scene for Stockholm. I'm coming back to youth, and I think when we speak about the youth, Sarah, I think, mentioned youth as change agents. I do think this is an extremely important aspect, and also not for us in my proficiency, or John in yours, or Hussein in his, not to put over the burden of responsibility to the youth, but to involving the youth as solution provider, as listening to the youth on what is a meaningful discussion policy outcome for the youth, without putting the responsibility of providing the solution. I did also hear in many different words and shapes a fit for purpose governance framework, and how do we fit our current multilateral system to the geopolitical context of today. And this was, I think, already in my introduction as one of the keys that I picked up last time. I also heard, and again, colleagues use different words, but in one way or another, the importance of having a, let's say, meaningful framework for finance. And Arthur, in a sense, spoke a lot about this also, and I kind of translate his different aspects into what we measure matters. And that's really about looking at the economic systems in the longer term. The human rights-based approaches, the indigenous peoples' perspective, protection of environmental defenders is also some of the kind of keywords. And just to kind of conclude, this morning we had in Sweden a new prime minister, and when she spoke about Stockholm+50 in her declaration, she used the words of Olof Palme and his, I think, concluding remarks in Stockholm in 1972, which said, our future is common. We must share it together. We must shape it together. And to me, those words are also very much reflecting the solidarity perspective. And the final comment is, Adil spoke about, what would people who were in Stockholm 50 years ago, what would they be surprised about today? I think I would really like to, have that discussion and putting ourselves 50 years ahead and think about what would we like to be surprised about in 50 years' time, looking back to Stockholm. And Stockholm+50 is for us something we co-host together with Kenya, but it's really a co-creation, bottom-up process for representatives here, for member state, for the wider stakeholder community to contribute to the success of the meeting with their meaningful contributions. So with that, I thank you.
Johanna, thanks. And what a wonderful way to conclude with your reactions, reflections, and also with your new Prime Minister. Congratulations. And her reflections there. And also, Johanna, thanks for staying with us for all of last week's session and all of this week's session. Really appreciate it, and for engaging so actively. With that, final word goes to Hussein. Thank you all for joining us. Hussein, over to you.
Thank you, John. I can just only say the least out of the very important points that have been made by our colleagues. Really, warm words of thanks to and appreciation to all of the panelists, the speakers. I myself will re-listen and re-look at this dialogue again, because there was a lot of details that I need to decompose and actually use them for our own purpose, for our own functioning of the EMG itself, let alone much wider important issues. I think we felt, if I wanted to summarize what I observed in general, I felt a lot of not only amount of knowledge and experience, but also passion that was really clearly coming out. And this is the power of the environment. When we have a discussion over environment, we can feel it, that people who are talking with a lot of passion, and this is the power that hopefully makes us hopeful for the future of the environment. We are very proud that we made an attempt to make it intergenerational by having colleagues from different history, a different history of this process coming together. And we hope to do that also in the future. We are very much thankful to colleagues such as Joan, who have stayed such a long at such a long time and late time actually with us. She is in Philippines and it's almost midnight. So thank you, Joan, for really bearing and staying with us. Again, this is a proof of your passion and dedication to the cause. We've heard a lot of words coming both in a sense of a substance and the content and the functions of the environmental agenda that needs to be revisited, but also on the forms, and that these two cannot be independently discussed. And my humble personal opinion is that if next year conference is going to be very much focused on the themes, specific subjects, it cannot discuss those in absence of functions and also the forms. And somehow there has to be a conjunction of these two discussions together. And with that, I really would like again to thank you. We would be producing the report, the summary of these discussions for further for people who have not been able to attend. We will continue our interactions with the UN system, as I said in the beginning, with the UN system, with certain heads of agencies interviews on this topic, and we're also liaise with the EMG and UN focal points in the EMG to really get into some more details discussions with them, hopefully to bring these things together as a perspective to the meeting next year. I think that is it. I would have liked to maybe provide some later on, maybe at another opportunity, some perspectives or insight as how actually within the UN system can we talk to each other better. How can we bring this horizontal system of narratives to a vertical system of operations in a much more coordinated and operational manner in the future? But hopefully in the future, we will provide also those, and that will also integrate it in the report of the EMG. With that, I would very much like to thank you again for all your dedication, support to the EMG, to the UN system, to this cause, and look forward to our close cooperation in the future. Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.